Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liam Thornton. I'm an associate professor in UCD School of Law, and today UCD School of Law hosts the book launch for Ronit Lentin and Vukašin Nedeljkovic and their new work, Disavowing Asylum, documenting Ireland's asylum industrial complex. We will be joined in chair by Dr. Anne Mulhall shortly, and will give a more substantive introduction to the panel we have for today's book launch. So I just have to provide just a few housekeeping issues if my computer would cooperate, but it has stopped cooperating. So I'm going to try to get that working again. First of all, the seminar and this book launch rather is being recorded. So just to let you know that. Second, we have a Q&A function. You can see the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions that you'd like to put to Ronit, Vukašin, Lucky, or Bulelani, please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A box below. The chat panel is also open for all to say hello to. And then the final one, and I stop sharing screen just for a moment while hopefully this will now work. We have a hashtag for today's event, which is hashtag Disavowing Asylum. So for those of you on Twitter who'd like to share some of your reflections on today's launch, please don't hesitate to tweet, including hashtag Disavowing Asylum. And prior to handing over to Anne, my final task is to just make you aware of the discount code, which the authors have generously shared with us for 30% off Disavowing Asylum. Don't worry if you haven't managed to scribble down the discount code. I'll send all that information on chat. So without so then my final task is to introduce the chair for today's launch, who's Dr. Anne Mulhall. And as many of you may know, is an associate professor in UCD School of Law, UCD School of English, Drama and Film, and co-director of the UCD Centre for Gender, Feminisms and Sexualities. Anne's prolific research would be well known to many of you, intersecting queer, feminist, psychoanalytical theory, contemporary Irish writing and culture, and critical migration studies. Anne, floor is yours.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks so much for organising this today. And thanks to UCD Sutherland School of Law for hosting. And thank you, Ronit and Vukašin, for inviting me to chair the panel and the launch. And thanks, Ronit, Vukašin, Lucky and Bulelani for everything that you do. So it gives me great pleasure to be here and to introduce people today, to be here with these incredible people and to take part in the launch of Ronit and Vukašin's really vital book, Disavowing Asylum, documenting Ireland's asylum industrial complex. Just really quickly to introduce the four speakers on the panel, we have our two authors, Dr. Ronit Lentin, who is well known to everybody. Ronit has written extensively on Ireland as a racial state and also on the direct provision and asylum system, just among many other things. So she's an esteemed activist, academic, and teacher. She's responsible for, if you like, the politicization of several generations of Irish people and people in Ireland. And I want to also introduce Vukašin Nedeljkovic, who also has authored this book. Vukašin is best known for his work with Asylum Archive. Vukašin is an artist, a writer, and an activist, and his work is important work of artist activism, as the book makes really clear. We have two respondents, two of the best respondents that we could have really on this panel today. Bulelani and Mfaco, apologize for the pronunciation. Bulelani is one of the coordinators of MAMASI, the Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland. The work that Bulelani has done, it's hard to really say how important it's been in many different ways, as well as all of the work that he does in changing this country and its border regimes. Bulelani is also a doctoral researcher in TUD. And finally, but certainly not last in any respect, Lucky Khambule, who needs no introduction, coordinator of MASI, the Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland, and really the kind of driving force behind the enormous changes and transformations that we've seen since, over the last, how long now, 8 years in this country, in terms of the direct provision and asylum system and the centering of the voices of people who have been through that system. Now, I said there that it gives me pleasure to be here today, but I want to just clarify or qualify that pleasure. It would be better if there were no need for this book, if there were no need for the never-ending and tireless work that all of these activists and organizers do, and many others as well, if they could just go about their lives. It would be better if the vast and deep suffering up to the point of death that so many people endure and have endured in this system did not exist. But unfortunately, this is so far from the case, as we know. So this book is a very necessary work. And I would say it is a deeply activist work that courageously departs from sort of accepted Irish academic norms in many ways. We don't come across very many decolonizing works in academic scholarship in Ireland, but this is one. It does this in order to generate new ways of knowing, new ways of researching, and new ways of acting that resolutely puts at its center the experience, testimony, organizing work, and importantly, the analysis of those who have been incarcerated and violated by the Irish, the EU, and the global border regimes of asylum, detention, deportation, and death. Importantly, Vukašin and Ronit's book puts the words and analysis of people who have experienced direct provision at the center, not as victims eliciting the pity of privileged others, but as agents of change and resistance, as they say. The book is underpinned by a recognition of direct provision and asylum and deportation regimes as shaped by what they call the coloniality of migration, and contemporary border regimes as a direct continuation of colonial violence and appropriation. This is something that is felt knowledge for a lot of the people on this panel today. The analysis of direct provision, a for-profit system as the asylum industrial complex, is also shaped by the grounded and experienced knowledge and analysis and testimony of those who have been its human meat, to borrow the words of the great Lucky Khambule. This book makes an important contribution to how we understand direct provision and asylum in a way that will contribute not just to academic knowledge and research and method, but more importantly, to activist movements and strategizing. This work, the work of people affected, the people with the important knowledge of our contemporary regimes of death and dereliction, is after all the work that really changes things. It's the only way that true emancipation and transformative justice can be reached for all of us. We have a huge debt actually to people who are doing this work. And as allies and supporters, people like me must work together with those who are leading this movement, those at the front line of these struggles. And this book does that. Do you know what I mean? It does that in this particular kind of in its method and in its centering of the voices of those who've experienced this system. And I think in particular in the work of Vukašin, that gives shape to this analysis. And with that, I want to quickly highlight two aspects. There's so many things I could say about the book, but two aspects that I find particularly inspiring and perhaps a little humbling. And the first is this method that Ronit and Vukašin have generated, which is shaped by Vukašin's asylum, by the diary at the beginning of the book, and by the inclusion of the visual testimony from Asylum Archive and from the mapping of the asylum and deportation system in Ireland. Vukašin's ethnographic account and analysis gives the project its center and shape. And perhaps later I can read just a passage from that, maybe if we have time later on, but I don't want to take up too much time here, but it is a deeply affecting piece that I think changes the game in terms of how we approach this kind of work. Second, the emphasis, and this is very important to me and to everyone here, the emphasis on the self-organizing and resistance of people themselves is at the heart of this book. In particular, the impact of the work of MASI, the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, has had in putting asylum seekers at the center of any discussion and action in relation to direct provision and asylum in Ireland. It informs this work. It almost gives it its kind of grounds of being in a way. So this is a book that makes a real commitment to decolonizing knowledge, to enabling action and transformative change. And now I want us to turn to our four panelists who have all made such huge contributions to social justice for people incarcerated in direct provision and states of deportability, but also actually for everybody in this country. And so we're going to first hear from the two authors. First, Dr. Ronit Lentin, and then Vukašin Nedeljkovic, and then we'll hear from the two respondents, Bulelani Mfaco and Lucky Khambule. So Ronit, if you want to start us off.
Thank you very much, Anne. You've said lots of the things that I was going to say, but I'd like to first of all thank Liam Thornton and the UCD School of Law for organizing it, to my co-writer Vukašin Nedeljkovic, and to the webinar participants, particularly to Anne Mulhall, who has been a colleague and a relentless supporter as an ally of asylum seekers, for chairing the session so ably. And of course, to our colleagues and brothers, Lucky Khambule and Bulelani Mfaco, without whom a lot of this work will not be possible. I'd like to not forget the publishers, of course, who have published it, but to the two commissioning editors, my daughter, Alana Lentin, and Gavin Titley, who have commissioned the work in their series, Challenging Migration Studies. And of course, to you, the audience, for being here with us. I'd like to speak a little bit about the reason for doing this book. I've been an anti-racist activist for a long time. Being a migrant myself, of course, a voluntary migrant, not an asylum seeker, I have always taken a great interest in asylum seekers and supporting them since the 1990s. And I've always been appalled by Ireland's poor record of admitting asylum seekers and giving refuge to people fleeing persecution. This happened actually since World War II, where only 60 Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe were accepted by neutral Ireland between 1933 and 1946, and continued through Ireland's reluctant acceptance of international law instruments for accepting refugees. The book doesn't deal with the legal issues. This has been done very ably and very fruitfully by Liam Thornton and of course by MASI. But it's important to stress here that Ireland has a very poor record in admitting refugees and accepting refugee applications. In fact, Ireland was ranked last time we looked, is 46th in the world in terms of applications, asylum applications, and it has an extremely low rate of admitting refugees. Last time we looked, it was 55th out of 183 countries in the world, and it's far behind our smallest EU counterparts, including Malta, for instance. The book focuses on the inhumane direct provision regime. Direct provision was instituted in 1999 following Britain dispersing asylum seekers throughout the country. Ireland always followed Britain immigration regimes because it's always been considered to be Britain's back door in terms of immigration and asylum. And the system, which was initially aimed for only 6 months, includes now people who have been in the system for almost 9 or 10 years, still waiting for the applications to be processed. Many people linger there and in inhumane conditions, and I'm sure we'll hear much more about it from Bulelani and from Lucky. But overcrowding, poor conditions and all that is totally unaccepted. So this really kind of made me want to do something in terms of writing about it alongside my activism, anti-racist activism over the years. But it's important to stress my positionality. As I said, I'm not an asylum seeker. I've not experienced it, but I had the real huge fortune to work together with Vukašin, who has experienced it, and as Anne says, his direct provision diary has been indispensable to make the reality of living in direct provision apparent. But the role of solidarity and allyship has also been very important. I know that Massey, since its establishment, always stressed the need to work together with allies and supporters, of whom Anne is a prime example. She's hugely important, and her words, in fact, are included in the book, and I'll talk about it later. Methodologically, we see it, and thank you, Anne, for your words about it being a decolonizing piece of work. I hope so. But this is a work of talking back, and I'm taking it from the words of Linda Smith in a book called Decolonizing Methodology, where the racialized talk back at racial states. And Linda Smith stresses the importance of theory. She said we shouldn't jettison theory, but we should remember that the racialized are often researched rather than given the voice. And I also would consider it as a work of surveillance, as opposed to surveillance, because asylum seekers are being surveyed all the time, including by cameras, which are installed in all the direct provision centers, and by having to sign in every day. Surveillance is like surveillance from below. Basically, the racialized are surveying the racial state or the racial regime. And it's important to remember that this is a work of talking back, and as is a work of Massey. And it's also a work of archiving, which Vukašin has done, but what he has archived there is very often the silences that are accompanying the lives of asylum seekers. I'd like to briefly talk about some of the theoretical perspectives that are highlighted in the book, and then I'll pass the floor to Vukašin. The first one is the Act of Disavow. It's the title of the book is Disavowing Asylum, and basically we would say that the direct provision regime continues a legacy of Ireland's long history of incarcerating people, particularly psychiatric patients, unwed mothers and their children and other poor children. Thousands and thousands of unwed women, unwed mothers who had babies out of wedlock have been incarcerated in institutions run by the Catholic Church, Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, where many people, many children and also women have died. And the industrial school, where 173,000 children have been incarcerated, have been abused both physically, emotionally, and many have been abused sexually. But 9,000 children have died in the mother and baby homes. And this is a huge number if you think of it. This incarceration system, which the authors O'Donnell and O'Sullivan have called coercive confinement, have hounded Ireland. And lots of people, they've been basically disavowed by the state, hidden from view in countries, in cities and towns throughout Ireland. And yet, although people supposedly didn't see these people, they actually knew about what was going on there. So disavowal and denial is actually a paradox. When you say you don't know something, you often say it about something you actually know. And these people were known to the Irish public, even though many of them managed not to know. And likewise, they managed not to know for many years about asylum seekers incarcerated in direct provision centers. If it wasn't for the work of Massey, particularly, and its supporters, we would not know about it to this day, because the state doesn't really speak very much about it. And even though recently the last coalition government is committed to end direct provision, we still have to wait and see. As Anne said, this book should not have been done. But even if things change, this book is a historical record. It's important to be out there, I think, you know. So we cannot say we manage not to know anymore, but still lots of people don't think about asylum seekers because they're hidden by the state. And the second kind of theoretical element is race, because like people in the institutional incarceration passed for racialized, including children of mixed heritage or mixed race, have been racialized by the state, so asylum seekers are being racialized by the state, segregated, dehumanized, not taken into consideration, the voices not taken on board. Although, of course, race is not about color, it's not about, many of them are not black or brown, but it's about being set apart by the racial state. And race is threaded throughout the book because this is a racial regime of incarceration, racial regime of that the state exercises against its racialized others, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and travelers. Let us not forget. The third element is the industrial complex idea. Like in the United States, where the prison industrial complex, highlighted by activists such as Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, both African-American abolitionists and scholars, the direct provision system is operated by private operators who are making huge amounts of money on the misery of asylum seekers. They've been paid 1.6 billion euro between 2000 and 2020 by the state, basically by all of us, by taxpayers, for paid to a very small number of operators, Aramark and other companies who are making huge money by confining asylum seekers, by overcrowding them, by not giving them proper food or proper service, by basically neglecting them. The standards are horrendous, and they and the state make money because it's not only them, it's also people who supply services and goods for these centers who make the money, and there are jobs to be had. And basically, asylum seekers are a source of income for the racial state. Therefore, we call it the asylum industrial complex. Abolitionist theorists in the States say that the prisons are there to supposedly deal with social problems such as homelessness, drugs, and so on, crime, and so on and so forth. But these problems are not dealt with. They're not really hidden. The people who are hidden are the people who carry these problems. Most of them are racialized people who are black and brown in the United States. Likewise, the problem of asylum and immigration is not sorted by these direct provision centers. On the contrary, people are hidden from view, put on the margin of society, until recently not allowed to work. Only thanks to Massey's amazing campaign, they've been allowed to work, but basically still marginalized and not treated as fully human. And finally is the issue of resistance, which Anne highlighted. Asylum seekers are not just victims of the racial state. They're agents of change and resistance. And what the book tries to document is the fact that they have always resisted their incarceration. From the Hungarians who came to Ireland in 1956 after the Soviet invasion, who hunger struck against their incarceration, and they were in am I pronouncing correctly? In the army barracks in County Clare, where asylum seekers still live today, which is absurd. But you know, it's interesting that the Hungarian refugees, actually most of them left the country because they hated their conditions of incarceration. Then there was Arasi in the 1990s, the Association of Refugees and Asylum Seekers, also staged various strategies of resistance, and we document that as well. But interestingly enough, Arasi was taken over by an NGO called Spirasi. Initially, Spirasi helped them, these were the Spirit and Fathers, and then they took over not only their work, but also their title. And it's interesting, this is why Massey, which is a current organization staging resistance to the racial state and incarceration, basically refused to work with asylum with the NGOs, because basically Massey wants to speak for themselves and they know what to do. And NGOs very often work for their own existence to maintain their own funding and so on and so forth. So the book documented acts of resistance, and of these acts of resistance, Asylum Archive is a hugely important part. Vukašin has documented visually the centers and has archived these visuals. And he has done a lot to highlight and visibilize the existence of these direct provision centers. And I pass on the floor to Vukašin, who will talk now about asylum archive. Thank you so much.
It's my absolute pleasure, honor, and privilege to be here in this meeting with you, comrades. And I can't thank enough Ronit, Lentin, for inviting me in a way, or asking me, would you like to write a book on direct provision many moons ago? And we started our conversation, and we have been meeting over the last couple of years. And what we have today is the launch of the book that I think it's of paramount of importance in a discourse of direct provision that doesn't fade. My personal experience of being incarcerated is old one, if you like. 2007, April, and then November 2009. But the memories, the ghosts, the traces, the resistance haunts me up to today. This is something that is extremely difficult to forget. This is something that is impossible to forget. Having this book, academic book, activist book, is extremely important in the discourse of, as Anne mentioned and Ronit after, of decolonizing the knowledge of our state, our estate, that does treat people lingering in open prisons that are open, still functioning as we speak in Ireland, in our estate, is something extremely worrying. I do hope that, and I would like to say the possible, and I was thinking, what's the word, significance of this book, or importance of this book, if that's the word, as in my view, reading very little books on direct provision, reading loads of reports on direct provision, but this is the first book, if you like, that has an account of ally, comrade, Ronit Lentin, and myself, survivor. I cannot define myself anymore any further as only a pure survivor. That's what I think I am, and I think that's what I will forever be. The trauma, my personal trauma, is coming from way back, and the reason why I sought refugee status in Ireland back in the days is a personal story, but it's very well portrayed in, I believe and hope so, in Direct Provision Diary. And there's been a lot going on in the world in the last year and a half. To me, it seems like a total suspension of time. I don't even know where to begin. As a survivor, I can only say, again, extremely grateful to Ronit, extremely grateful to Anne Mulhall, Lucky Khambule, Bulelani, Yevgeny, Joe Moore, etc., 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 who really dedicated or still dedicate their time, their energy, their efforts in the construction. What we all really would like to see is end of direct provision. I think this book will bring a light of many forgotten ones who have died and perished in direct provision. From my own personal research, followed by an exhibition in Galway Art Centre in 2015, I think I stopped counting at 80. From my personal belief, I think it's over 100 people at the moment who have died in direct provision. Children, fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters. The amount of people who have been deported brutally from this state of Céad Míle Fáilte is something that we'll never know. As much as we'll never know how many babies have been buried in Irish soil, sold across the board. I think the figures really don't do any justice here. I think what we have to remember as comrades, allies, survivors, that we have to keep going. That's why I agree 100% with Ronit in terms of Massey and movement of asylum seekers of Ireland, that at the moment do carry burden of representation, if you like, a burden of many of those who are still incarcerated in direct provision center. And Bulelani Mfaco being one of them, absolute kudos to you, comrades. I have really nothing to say but kudos, and it's pretty phenomenal, unbelievable how you keep going, how many others keep going, who may join us later on for Q&A. And I don't know, I don't know if I'm an artist, I don't know if I'm an activist, I'm just doing my best. I don't know who I am anymore. I think that's the kind of good point of departure, if you like, for someone. I think that the work that has been done over the last 21 plus years in terms of direct provision, emergency accommodation centers, etc., is really important to highlight the continuation of institutional abuses that have happened in this state of Ireland. That I must say, I'm very happy, if that's the word, happy. I have no home. You see, I'm stateless still. My home, I was born in Belgrade, which is former Yugoslavia. That doesn't exist. It has been diminished, demolished from within and from without, from inside and from the outside. So I have no home. So I can't go back to Yugoslavia because it doesn't exist anymore. So this is my home. I have nowhere to go. And I think as citizens, which is a wrong concept in my words, following the referendum many moons ago, I think we're all citizens, and I would really like to go back to ARN slogan, and really who lives here belongs here. And for me, it's really not important, is it, for me personally, it's not important who it is. Is it Arasi or ARN or ADI or Massey? As Lucky have said once, we are all Massey, but maybe that's going to cause a conflict between different groups, if you like. I think we all need to step out from this and work together as best as we can. Academics, artists, activists, immigration lawyers. We still have some good ones, right? Etc. to help dismantle, abolish this system of incarceration. And as suggested by the government, and I will conclude here, white paper is abominable and not acceptable in my view. And I think the struggle must continue. And I would like to commend really everyone. Yeah, my name is Vukašin, but I think it's really good that people in direct provision in Balikonis that I always lament on in a way, call me Vuka, and I think Vuka Vuka in Swahili means wake up, wake up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vukašin and Ronit, for talking about some of the central kind of ideas that you generated in the book, and Vukašin, speaking from your own experience, but this is the reality. Do you know what I mean? The reality of what people have been through, what you've been through, and its legacy, but also the need to work together, you know, to overcome conflicts and to find a way to work together in coalition, and also to name some of the other people and organizations who've been so important on a in a kind of grassroots resistance over a number of decades now. You named Joe Moore and Anti-Deportation Ireland, Anti-Racism Network, there's many others, there's Ramsey. Yeah, so just it's important as well to acknowledge all of that long struggle between people incarcerated in the system and their allies. So with that, we're going to turn over to our two comrades from Massey. I don't know who would like to speak first. Lucky, you want to go?
Thank you. Because of time, I need to be out by 1 o'clock. And thank you, and good afternoon, comrades, friends. It is indeed a great pleasure for us to be with you here today. And it's a historic day to us to be in this launch of this unique book, first of its kind, and highlighting the work of people that have been working with the marginalized groups, and the work that has been done before, like the likes of Joe. We thank Joe very, very much as well. He was with us from day one during our struggle, during our protest, which is covered extensively on this book in Cork. Actually, this week is the anniversary of that struggle, of that strike in Cork. It was on the 15th of September of 2014. So this week marks the 7th anniversary of that important action that led to everything that people see here today. So we can't thank people enough that have been there for us, or with us, and with the understanding as well, and the respect that people have been giving us in terms of taking their own time to work with us, and the realization as well of the fact that we said that we want to be our own voice. During that struggle, during that strike, we said no one must come and talk to us or talk for us. We wanted to talk for ourselves. So that is the spirit of which we continued to, and also to just make sure that we work with everybody that has got the same vision and same goal for us. This book is so very, very important. We say that it is of great importance that we as migrants, asylum seekers and refugees, do find the courage to define ourselves in our own way, and not just allow other people to define us. And it's very, very important to us as we speak with people that we have been given that mouth to be able to speak And also very important for us to be given that platform as well to be able to do so. And this book also gives us that platform for our voices to be amplified. And we thank really our comrades Ronit and Vukašin for giving us that space and to continuously speak on our behalf. And also the two comrades that's showing the greater understanding of the plight of those that seek protection, who are marginalized and forgotten. This book helps us with regard to that. It portrays the realization that someday we shall all be triumphant over all adversities we continually come across. Some might take these as stories, but to us is a reflection of the way of life we continue to live under all these serious conditions in direct provision. As I said, mercy is all about collaboration, collective approach, speaking together in one voice. It is impossible to ignore once we are together and we can speak in one voice. And this approach as well is reflected on this book. I like the narrative there, especially from Vukašin. If you read this book and you read the testimony there by Vukašin in terms of the detailed day-to-day activities, and it makes reference as well to the annoying fly. You can just imagine yourself in that room, sitting in that room, and this fly that is just keeps on annoying you. But what we hear from officials, which is something that we always oppose, the fact that we should be grateful because we've got lights, we've got beds, we've got roof, we're feeding you. Officials need to understand that life is not all about lights. There could be lights in your room, but it could be the darkest room you could ever imagine in your life, in full darkness of direct provision. Bed, roof, and food do not matter if you are constantly constrained in your life. You have got no control over your life. Life is about family, freedom to move without worrying about catching the last bus, missing your last meal, because you are afraid of sleeping on an empty stomach. Life is about having your private life and not to share the same space with complete strangers, with nothing separating grown-up men and women. Life is about progress on education with equal opportunities for all. It's about having the reason to wake up early in the morning and contribute positively to society. The day-to-day life is eloquently explained by Vukašin here. He says, I quote, "I close my eyes. I can still hear the noise the fly is making. I open the door. I hope the fly will leave my room." We constantly are worried about deportation or the deportability of the people. Jomo is the leader of the anti-deportation island. He puts it very well in terms of the trauma and the mental health that deportation brings to asylum seekers waiting for their decision. The mere fact that people are kept in hostels and are forced to report every day talks to the fact that it is easy to get to the people and they have nowhere to go. Just this Saturday, we visited a reception center in Balseskin and to meet the newly arrival. And one of the questions that amazed me from the people that are just new in the country was the fact that there was fear of deportation. There was a question that came from the floor about deportations. How are they dealt with there? How are they here? How are they challenged or people being protected? So it shows that the fear of deportations is just so huge in these centers. The writers explain also as to how people suffer and die in stateless, homeless, and sometimes nameless. Last month, we took a day to honor and remember those that passed on living in direct provision. There come a time in years to come where the government of the day will be called to account for these deaths. They are still not informing the public, let alone the families, on how their loved ones lost their lives. Like the family of Steve Biko, forcing the government to open the inquest of the death of their loved one in the hands of the apartheid regime. We too must make the government to account for the lives that have been lost under their care. Asylum seekers are continually racially attacked no matter what they do. The calls and emails we receive from Mercy on regular basis are an example of how people think about us. A few months ago, we even got a call from an investigating officer to say that they have a letter that state that we have been earmarked by the group that seem to hate migrants, and they wanted to make us aware that they will protect us no matter what comes. The book also talks about the profits, the profit-making machine. They, in direct provision, dropped the standards deliberately to maximize profits. Children's needs, especially education, are completely ignored and neglected. Otherwise, Donna, Vuma and her team would not be doing what they do to try and raise funds to make sure that people do get their uniforms and stationery when they come for back to school. Mercy and Bose wouldn't be buying presents every Christmas to put smiles on the people's or children's children in direct provision, just to make them feel part of society. Whereas millions and millions are spent on direct provision, but not on people who they care for. The book also touches very, very much on resistance, and resistance is just our strength at Mercy. Like the crocodile, you can't beat the crocodile in water. Put Mercy on resistance, that's where we strive. This book in chapter 6 demonstrates that. It covers extensively the resilience by the people on the ground to say no to mistreatment. And it's only when people take such actions that can be a change in this system. The right to work, when it came, it had so much obstacles and limitations, but it was through our resistance, through our resilience to say this is wrong, it cannot work for us. Make sure that it changes, and we have seen those changes in bits by bits as we move on. When the COVID-19 came, it was Mercy that stood up to say this is wrong. The approach by the government to save the people in the direct provision center by overcrowding. We were the one that were vocal in terms of that. The book covers all that. Finally, we got to use every opportunity, everyone that is here in this call, to get to be in the position to say that direct provision needs to end and it cannot be reformed. We need to stop deportations. We need to call for residency for all so that they are not fried in that direct provision for many, many years. We need to get the government to issue licenses to people so that they can carry on with their lives. I just want to thank the writers, everyone that is on the call. Also pick up to my colleague and Bulelani for the sterling work that he keep continually do, even when the state is not listening to him for his personal case. But all in all, when we are together, we can achieve more. Thank you very much. Amandla, await.
Amandla, thanks so much, Lucky. We'll just move straight to your comrade Bulelani.
He's going to run for the train soon. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be one of the respondents to the launch of this book. I won't be very long, I'll be very brief. I want to start by borrowing from experiences from back home. When we were young kids, I think Lucky will relate to this in South Africa. Our stories, our history that we were taught in school began in 1652 with the arrival of colonial masters. That's the way our history was written and was taught to us in the schools. That life in South Africa began in 1652. There was nothing before then. It was a complete erasure of the experiences of Black people who had lived in South Africa for centuries. We weren't taught anything about that. We grew up knowing that our colonial master came in as some sort of saviors to give us piped water, and they make us civilized. They speak about the barbarians of Africa who were described as barbarians. And we're expected to then be very grateful to our colonial masters for bringing us civilization. And that's how history was taught to us. It was hardly contested for 4 centuries in South Africa. It only began changing when Black people started actually writing their own history. And then you begin to see a story that emerges of the experiences of life for Black people that wasn't as historians had recorded. It's very much different to what they described. And I think the book, for me, I want to situate Disavowing Asylum in that context of decolonial work, that it flips the coin on the story of direct provision in Ireland, because if you read one of the quotes in the book from the former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, it says, direct provision is ultimately a service provided by the state, free accommodation, food, heat, lighting, education, and some spending money. It frames the system of direct provision as a benevolent, the Irish state's benevolent way of meeting the needs of asylum seekers, and erases an awful lot of the experiences of asylum seekers that have been documented by both domestic and international human rights bodies, who've documented the cruel and unjust, really oppressive nature of the system of direct provision. If it is cruel and oppressive to deprive one human being of the fundamental human rights that you, as Leo Varadkar, enjoys, the right to privacy, the right to human dignity, and the rights of children, and the best interest of the child to prevail always. Those are things that we do not see in policy discourse when it comes to direct provision. Irish politicians would frame it as a way, especially those who are in government, of course, frame it as a way of Ireland's meeting its international obligations, ignoring all the deplorable conditions that asylum seekers have been have had to endure over the years. And one of the things that the book highlights is the absence then in the analysis of the system of direct provision of the proper wording to describe the experience of asylum seekers in direct provision. So for instance, it speaks about racializing asylum seekers. It speaks about direct provision as part of the racial order. It speaks about segregation. Now you can go to any of the NGOs, I challenge you to do this actually. Go to any of the NGOs who work on asylum and migration issues in Ireland, and you look for the word segregation in reference to direct provision. I think you'll find it very difficult to find it because they speak in a language that is very polite, that massages, in a tone that massages the state's handling of the system of direct provision. And the book then, for me, flips the coin and shows us the other side of the coin that is not so polite, that actually describes segregation for what it is. Segregation, racial segregation for what it is actually, without the necessary polite and cultural, because we don't actually need funding from the state. We don't have to be polite in engaging with them. We don't have to be polite in the words that we use. We don't have to be careful of how we frame the system of direct provision. A very few of them would speak of it as a dehumanizing system. They do speak about how awful it is, but they don't use the word dehumanize. It's very seldom. I can't even remember from the top of my head reading such language from them. So for me, it maps out the very structure of asylum or the asylum reception system in Ireland, and how it fits into the racial order in Ireland in general, that you have hierarchies of who gets what from the state when it comes to public goods and services. And those hierarchies aren't new. We've seen them before. We've seen them in the US. We've seen them in the UK. We've seen them in apartheid South Africa, where you had what we called the Calabar, where you had you could have white, black, and Indian people working together in a factory floor, but would be treated very much differently, both in terms of everyday interaction in the workplace, but also in terms of remuneration. And we have the same in Ireland, where you have asylum seekers. Some are allowed to work. They are all within direct provision. Some are allowed to work. Some are not allowed to work, but they are all in the system of direct provision. So we have a state that finds it very easy to draw a distinction amongst an already marginalized community. And that ease with which the state is able to discriminate tells us that actually it isn't interested in vindicating fundamental human rights, because if it was, there wouldn't be such distinctions. You wouldn't be interested in drawing a distinction between asylum seekers. You'd only be interested in vindicating their fundamental rights and ensuring that people are able to reach their full potential, and not imposing laws and regulations that make it impossible for people to reach their full potential, purely for no reason other than the fact that they came to this country seeking asylum. And so the book for me is one that critically shows us a mirror with which to hold this Irish state accountable for the millions of euros that it has spent to deliberately strip asylum seekers of their fundamental rights while putting them in direct provision. And I want to thank Vukašin and Ronit for actually putting the book together, because it tells a story that is contrary to the story that we hear from officialdom when it comes to the asylum system as a benevolent way of meeting Ireland's obligations to asylum seekers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that powerful response, Bulelani and Lucky, who may be gone, I'm not sure. So I'm just wondering if Ronit or Vukašin, if you have anything sort of to respond to the respondents? If there's anything that you would like to resonate for you?
Ronit, I'm fine, and I would like to maybe, Ronit, you want to go first, please?
Okay. Thank you very much, both Lucky and Bulelani, for your responses. Deportability is a very important issue, which I did not highlight. In fact, the fact that asylum seekers are concentrated in these centers make them candidates for deportation. And deportability is not necessarily deportation, but there have been huge numbers of deportations. And now we're having a cough, so I pass it on. Excuse me.
Okay, so yeah, that is one really important aspect of the book, is highlighting how central that state of deportability is to the whole system, in terms of the fear and the anxiety as well, that it kind of holds people in this state of paralysis. I have a question for Bulelani, I suppose, but also for anybody really. This is just about when, it's more to ask for your thoughts on it or to talk about it. You're talking there about the problem with NGOs and that kind of interface with the state and the kind of language and positions that have to be held. And I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about how Massey negotiates that, okay? Because it is the fact that Massey will kind of want to be in spaces where direct provision and asylum is being talked about, and book quotes you a piece by you on that. And so how do you negotiate that kind of space between retaining autonomy and independence and at the same time being in those spaces where those discussions are happening, or deciding when to be there and not be there? I just wonder if you could say a little about that. Is that okay?
I'm on. Oh, I muted myself there. I think for us, the one thing that has always guided us was on the nature of the conversation that is going to be had. So if we are going to be sitting at a table, what are we going to be talking about? Are we going to be talking about making minor improvements to the system of direct provision, so making tweaks here and then, or reforming direct provision? Or are we going to have an emancipatory dialogue around the asylum system in direct provision? So if we're going to be talking about ending the system of direct provision, great, we can sit around the table and we'll talk to you about it, but certainly be aware of your privilege while we are sitting on that table, that you speak in a position where you, one, don't have the same, you aren't oppressed, for starters. You aren't oppressed in the same way that I am. The state isn't being cruel and unjust to you for a prolonged period of time for reasons of you being here seeking asylum. I am. And so you need to come to me speaking, understanding that you actually don't, you have all the fundamental human rights, well, at least in theory, that I don't have in the way the state treats me. When you speak from that starting point, you are then able to understand what the remedy needs to be, and that the remedy doesn't actually become giving people pots and stoves in a direct provision center and saying, yay, we've done well for asylum seekers. It is actually getting people to a position where they are actually able to shape minor and major aspects of their everyday life without the state unjustly restricting them in the pursuit of happiness, really. And so for us, that negotiating that relationship between NGOs and the state, it becomes central that one, we only get involved in conversations that speaks about emancipating people in the system of direct provision. Otherwise, why even bother? Why do we have to bother to sit around the table if we're going to be talking about pots and stoves? into getting pots and stoves into direct provision centers. If we're going to talk about closing direct provision center, yay, brilliant. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. And I think we've made that very clear, which is something that a lot of the NGOs wouldn't necessarily be doing, because much of their work is providing a service to people in direct provision. So while when we're sitting on the table, you'll have the government who has the responsibility over the reception system in direct provision, and you might have some of the NGOs who are actually paid money by the government to deliver a service to asylum seekers, and then you'll have other NGOs who, for some reason, think it is their duty to fill in the gaps that the government isn't doing, instead of actually getting the government to do its job. So they will take on the responsibilities of the state where the state fails, if they give them funding to do so. And that funding, sadly, comes from the same fund. It's drawn down from the same fund that is actually used for deporting people. So the same amount of money that is the same funding pot that comes from that is drawn from the EU's asylum and migration fund, for instance, would be funding integration projects that are run by some of the NGOs. And that integration, of course, means that we are here doing, for a long time, it was something like, oh, teaching refugees to do this, teaching asylum seekers how to be integrated into Irish society, without actually integrating asylum seekers into Irish society. And so, for instance, you take people from a direct provision center and have some activity for them, you would have funding for that, but they'll still go back to the same direct provision center, still segregated. That's one thing that they don't want to talk about, that segregation. And so it's very, the relationship between us and NGOs is very, I don't know how to describe it, to put it into words. Sometimes we work together if we are talking the same language, but if we're not, it's just not going to happen. Oh, did I pause there? Yeah.
No, I'm muted, sorry. Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A that's actually asking, I think, a similar question to the one that you've answered. And so it's Ariel Glynn. He asks if you could explain the dynamic between Massey and other NGOs. Well, I think Massey isn't an NGO, is one thing to say, but also, yeah, the Massey uses more forthright language to describe direct provision and the book. For example, segregation, and Ronit mentioned that Massey wants to work independently from other Irish NGOs. I think that Bulelani has kind of spoken to that question, but is there anything, Ronit and Vukašin, that you might like to answer to respond to that?
I'd like just to mention one factor. NGOs, anybody who knows NGOs, knows that part of the work is to get funding for core funding. In other words, NGOs actually work to perpetuate themselves and the salaries that it's important. But basically, NGOs are not, they're about helping, they're about being the liberal good people, but actually moving away and giving the jobs of determine the policy and asking the right questions to the people who they work for, they don't do, most of them. And the classic case is Arasi and Spirasi, but in the telling of it, a former member of Arasi recently has written something for something else I've edited. He refused to actually indict Spirasi because he now works for an NGO. He's a former asylum seeker. And one thing former asylum seekers do, they work for NGOs. That's one of the things they can do. But the point is, being integrated into Irish society, we have to ask what sort of states do you want to be integrated into? I would like you to be integrated into a more equal state where there's no difference and the regime of race does not determine lives. And regimes of race are aimed to maintain white supremacy, bottom line. And I don't want to see a white society. I want society to be what it is, made up of all sorts of people, all sorts of classes, all sorts of ethnicities, races, etc. Genders, of course. you know, and we have to remember that NGOs have a role, but it's not the same role as bottom-up, migrant-led and traveler-led groups. And even though travelers have achieved huge achievements, they still are discriminated against. And we can see in Rosalind McDonough's beautiful play, The Abbey, they're still thrown at the side of the road, despite their huge achievements. We want you to lead us. We don't want you to be, to integrate you into our lives. We want you to live your lives here as you want to live them. This is what I would like.
Can I say, sorry.
Yeah, Vukašin.
Thanks, Ronit. I think it's very important, the part of the book that does tell or try to tell us about NGOization of direct provision. Okay, I think this is very important. Okay, just responding to Bulelani and the view that Massi has. So can we just make this clear for now and forever? Massi is not an NGO. ARN is not an NGO. ADI is not an NGO. Okay. Ramsey is not an NGO. RAR is not or was not an NGO. They are the people who dedicated their lives, their times, phones being ringing 3 in the morning, phones being ringing still 3 in the morning, if you know what I mean, in terms of Massi and etc. But what is really important here to say that, yes, I was on the board of Irish Refugee Council back in 2011 when I was doing my master's in the visual arts practice in IDT. Sue Conlon was the CEO at the time. One of my comrades, very close comrades, Alpha Gassama, got a deportation order. He wasn't held by NGOs. He wasn't held by IRC at the time. And I would like to bring that discourse from 2011, that memory, to a present day, because I believe nothing has changed. And we can talk about NGOs, and we can talk about NGOs in Irish discourse. And I don't think there is any difference about NGOism in any other European discourse. NGO is an NGO. It gets funding from the state, if you like. And in terms of the Irish discourse, it gets funded by the Irish state to continue with salaries, if you like. But that's the nature of an NGO, I think, how to dismantle an NGO. And I accept Ronit's, really, which is part of the book, Arasi versus Pirasi, but I have to go again to personal. If it wasn't Spirasi that offered me free counseling since 2007 till the present day, I don't know what would happen. If it wasn't for Galway Rape Crisis Center or Mayo Rape Crisis Center, I don't know what would happen with me, with my being, with my dusha. I don't know. So I, again, would like to say there's so many kind of nuances here.
Yeah.
And that we really have to kind of approach very, very sensibly and with sensitivity, if you know what I mean. What may work for one may not work for the other. But how to do that is a research question, if you like, or multiple research questions. So I don't have an answer. For me, if I can be 100% honest, and I'm going to go back to that part of the book of resistance in direct provision, I personally miss my time in direct provision in Ballyhoney's. I miss it deeply. Perhaps it's nothing to do with pandemic, or it has to do with pandemic, but through my whole entire being, and I'm 46 now, I haven't been as lonely as I am now, to be very honest with you. I miss my comrades in direct provision Ballyhoney's 2007 to 2009, because we resisted through the micro narratives, if you like, by drinking tea, having parties. Oh gosh, you would see the parties. They were absolutely phenomenal. And that's how we resisted at the time the incarceration and confinement by the state. And I'm not the only one who resisted it or the only one who survived. Many others survived. I'm grateful that the survivors from that time are still very good friends and comrades of mine. And only together, as again, I would like to say, I have no answer. I think this is really important. Going back to Bulelani about NGOization and about NGOs, how do we work this together? It's a big kind of mess, and the government makes deliberate mess and more messiness for us as comrades to being able to untangle it, if you like, and to set people free. And I think that really the only not advice, but the only I can offer as a survivor is, if we can, as a society, as Irish society, can go back to pre-direct provision. And I know there's been loads of failures there, but at least people were seeking asylum at the time, or refugee status, were allowed to apply for child benefit, if you like, rent allowance, and be treated, in my view, or what I have heard, less or more as humans, or less being dehumanized. And Ronit has that experience more than me, because I'm only here since 2006. But I think this is very important, that we learn from each other. And we pass the knowledge and the oral history, if you like, from one person to the other. And I think archiving is super important, is of paramount of importance. How to archive, and etc. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vukašin. There's a lot of nuance and wisdom in what you're saying that comes from having lived what you've lived, you know. Questions for a lot of us to think about. Liam, I think, did you want to speak to that question way back when? Are you? No, you okay? There's a question that Sarah Clancy is insistently asking, so I better, for the sake of domestic peace, put it out there. So this is about the implementation, the advisory implementation group for the white paper. So this is quite a technical thing, but Bulelani, I think this is probably for you. And so, as Sarah says, there's only one person on the advisory implementation group, one person who's experienced direct provision. So it says the board includes a former resident of direct provision, independent experts, non-governmental organizations working in the fields of reception and integration, key government departments and the housing agency. And Sarah wonders if panelists might give their views on whether that's something that again needs to be challenged, as Massey did, and ARN and others with the McMahon working group. Does anyone have anything to say to that?
Yes, it does has to be challenged.
Okay.
That's me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think from the experience of the Catherine Day group, I think one of the, I think it's important for people to remember that actually Massey was an afterthought, even in the Catherine Day group. I remember when we first got the email inviting us to participate in that group, it was actually at the suggestion of the NGOs that Massey should be invited to participate. But at the onset, we went. So I don't know if it makes much of a difference when you are, it doesn't make much of a difference to have just one person sitting there. It's the same for women. Would it make a difference if you had 10 men and one woman making a decision that will inevitably affect a lot of women? I don't think it would make much of a difference. And the same for asylum seekers, the same for traveler people, members of the traveler community. It's the same for LGBTQ plus people. Using a representation as a tokenistic kind of thing to show that you've included voices is useless if it doesn't actually ensure that proper representation doesn't equate to decisions that come out of there to reflect the broader experience of the people you whose lives you want to change. So doesn't make much of a difference that you have us involved. I don't think it makes a difference that we are in the, we should be in the board. We were asked to participate in the process, and we declined participating in the process of nominating representatives for that advisory board, because for one, the board is an oversight body. It merely just looks at what the government is doing. It holds the government to account for the government's commitments. We can hold the government accountable for its actions or lack thereof without having to sit in a board with them when you know that only the bureaucrats will prevail in whatever it is said in that committee. So from that point of departure, I don't think it would have been beneficial for us, and that's why we didn't want to participate in it, because we could easily hold the state accountable without having to be on the board. I think it's great that other people are willing to do it. It's great for them. They will get the experience, and they'll get to see the same things we saw when we participated in there. But for us, again, it's really power. When that you have the one person highlights just the power imbalance, because one person, as I did, find it very difficult to hold the line in terms of ensuring that the experiences of people in direct profession come through in the decisions that are made in that board.
Thanks very much for that answer. There's so much that could be said about what you're speaking about there, and about what could be learned from that whole experience going back of the working group and what came after it. But I'm going to turn to some other questions. So here's a question. Does anyone know why it's taking the Department of Justice so long to give decisions for applicants for international protection? Wasn't that supposed to be solved by lots of different things that came out of the working group, etc.? Yeah.
Everything that happens in any bureaucracy, the bureaucracy will always have an explanation for it, and that explanation may or may not be the whole truth. So if you ask a civil servant in the Department of Justice why decisions have been taking so long to come through the asylum system, they'll go back to McMahon, that they started from McMahon with a backlog when they introduced, but they won't tell you that they nitpicked which recommendations in the McMahon report they will implement, for instance, and I won't tell you the contribution of that to the backlogs that we have today, that the state actually hasn't invested enough resources in terms of processing and getting the stuff. They've used a combination of both panel people, that would be people who aren't directly employed by the state as civil servants, to process some of the asylum cases, but decisions aren't forthcoming from those people. So for instance, you've had people who go through for an interview, for instance, and wait for months and months on end to get a recommendation from the same panel. And that happens in the appeals tribunal. We got one actually communication from an asylum seeker who's been waiting for a year since they had their appeal hearing, and they don't have a decision from the tribunal member. Now, generally, the tribunal is quicker than the IPO when it comes to decisions for most cases, but we do find that in terms of processing, they don't invest the proper resources. The system isn't adequately resourced to handle the volume of people coming through the asylum system and to be able to process them in a timely manner. And that prejudices an asylum claim, because one, it is linked to justice, and it means that a person will not be able to enjoy all the same rights and privileges that Irish people enjoy, merely because they haven't been given a decision by the International Protection Office or the International Protection Appeals Tribunal.
It's terrible. There's so many awful, for everybody involved, it destroys people's lives. Then you have really clear-cut cases, you know, where people have a very clear-cut case of persecution, and they're still left waiting for years. This has happened to a number of people who've sought asylum here coming from Afghanistan, and it puts people in a position where their families are now stuck because of the whole process has taken so long for something that should have taken weeks. The families are now stuck in Afghanistan, and that's just one place, you know, because the family reunification process can't start until the person gets their asylum status. But like, you know this very well.
May I say one thing on that?
Yeah.
The reason it's taking such a long time, there are reasons which Liam possibly has documented and knows more about. The only reason is that Ireland is a racial state, and when refugees started arriving here in the 1990s in larger numbers, basically we had a refugee problem. Instead of saying, isn't it great? We are now in an economic position where people are attracted to come to Ireland. This is a good thing to happen. I recently had a case, I had to go to hospital for some reason. 70% of the medical and nursing personnel were visibly not Irish. Now, they're not necessarily asylum seekers, they're migrant labor. Without migrant labor, the Irish hospitality system would sink. So we need people to come in and service this country. We need people to continue the cultural diversity and richness of this country. And rather than seeing it as a problem for white Ireland, we should see the advent of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants as an opportunity. And Ireland has to rethink its whiteness and its supremacy. I'm sorry, this sounds very old-fashioned kind of race theory, but this is what it is. Ireland has to get over its racial regime. And this is the reason why it's taking such a long time.
Unmute, Anne. Sorry, Anne, you're muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So just one last question. We won't have time to answer this, but from Ken McHugh, it's just to put it out there, because I know there's a lot of people here from different agencies and NGOs. Now that Sport Against Racism are back working in direct provision centres, we notice physical and mental health issues amongst the youngsters. Can we create a multi-agency emergency response to tackle the problem? Just putting it out there to people. But I think we better go. We have 1 minute left. It just remains to say thank you so much to Ronit, to Vukašin, to Bulelani, and to Lucky. Ronit and Vukašin for this really significant book. Bulelani, Lucky, Vukašin, and Ronit, all of you for your contributions and what you had to say here today. It's just really so important and so much to go, to bring away, to think through and think on. Liam, thank you so much for organising this event. And I guess that's it for now. Okay. And direct